So hello there and welcome to my talk on AI and the constitutions of the future. Let me just start with an observation, which is that historically our social and legal systems have changed. We have cycled between republics, democracies, monarchies, and dictatorships. And sometimes these cycles have been precipitated by revolutions in technology. And then this is unsurprising. New technologies afford us new possibilities for action and social organization. Think, for example, of the new forms of social life that were made possible in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Will similar changes result from the AI revolution? Will a new social order emerge in its wake? In this talk, I want to present a model for thinking about this question, and I offer it not in the hope that it will convince people that I am right about the future, but instead in the hope that it will inspire people to think about the future in a different way. So instead of narrowing the horizon of possibility and assessing technology solely from our current historically contingent perspective, I believe that we can broaden the horizon of possibility and imagine very different futures. And I think this is in many ways the role of the humanities in human life. And it is one role that they can play in understanding the impact of AI on human life. In this talk, I do my bit by considering the impact of AI on the constitutions of the future. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, look, in my hand, I'm holding a copy of the Irish Constitution. It is the foundational legal text for the country in which I live. And like all other constitutions, it does two main things. First, it enshrines and protects the values of the Irish people. And second, it establishes the institutions of governance for the state. So when we ask about the impact of AI on the constitutions of the future, we are asking two related questions. Number one, how will AI affect the foundational values of a particular society? And number two, how will it affect the institutions of governance within that society? Now, both questions are critical and important, but I'm going to focus mostly on the first question in this talk. And I do this out of the belief that much of the existing literature on AI and constitutional orders typically assumes that our foundational values remain relatively fixed and non-negotiable. AI is then either perceived as a threat to those values or as a way in which to protect them. What I think is ignored, or at least overlooked in the debate, is the way in which AI could change the kinds of values that we enshrine and protect in the constitutions of the future. So that's where I want to focus for the remainder of this talk. Now, my analysis works from two observations. The first is that values change. And the values that someone like me, an educated, relatively prosperous male living in a liberal democratic state, holds dear are historically contingent. They have been handed down to me by centuries of philosophical thought, political change, and economic development. A cursory look at other cultures and other times makes it obvious that they are not the only values that it is possible to hold. Historically, many societies have endorsed slavery, denied women the vote, and routinely tortured criminals. Nowadays, most societies tend to reject such values. The second observation is that technology is one of the things that can affect how values change over time. Now, there are many theories that try to explain how this happens, but to illustrate, I'm going to use a theory from Ian Morris's book, Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels. Morris argues that energy is valuable to human beings. We need it to survive and thrive. And because of this, the technology that we use to capture energy and how relatively abundant energy consequently is in our societies affects our other values, particularly, according to Morris, our values associated with political equality, violence, wealth, and gender equality. So in foraging societies, the technology of energy capture is extremely basic. Foragers rely on human muscle and brain power to extract energy from an environment that is largely beyond their control. They form small bands that move about from place to place. Some people within these bands specialize in capturing energy through foraging, and others specialize in capturing energy through hunting. As a result, foraging societies tend to be quite egalitarian when it comes to social life and wealth distribution. They have a limited and precarious capacity to extract energy from the environment around them, and so they have to share when the going is good. They tolerate some violence in order to solve social disputes and, more importantly, to compete with rival groups for territory and resources. And they value intergroup loyalty, relative social equality, and bravery in combat as a result. These are the foundations of their value systems. Farming societies are quite different. They capture significantly more energy than foraging societies by controlling their environments and by intervening in the evolutionary development of plants and animals, and by fencing off land and dividing it up into estates that can be handed down over the generations. Now, prior to mechanization, farming societies relied very heavily on manual labor, often slavery, to be effective. And this led to the moralization and justification of social hierarchies and wealth inequality. There was also much greater gender inequality in farming societies because women were required to take on specific roles in the home, and the desire to transfer property through family lines placed a special emphasis and value on female sexual purity. Despite this, farming societies tended to be less tolerant of violence than foraging societies, unless the violence was done by the state. Farming societies couldn't survive if people constantly used violence to settle their interpersonal disputes. Finally then, fossil fuel societies capture enormous amounts of energies through the combustion and exploitation of fossil fuels, and later electricity, nuclear power, and other renewable energy sources. This enabled greater social specialization, urbanization, mechanization, electrification, and digitization. It became possible to sustain very large populations in relatively small spaces and to facilitate more complexity and mobility in society. As a result, fossil fuel societies tend to be more egalitarian than farming societies, particularly when it comes to political and gender equality, though maybe slightly less so when it comes to wealth equality. They also tended to be very intolerant of violence, particularly within a defined group or state. Now, the model I developed for understanding the constitutions of the future takes two key ideas from Morris's theory. The first idea is the notion of an ideal type of social order. So human society is complex. We frequently use simplifying labels to make sense of it all. And Morris makes use of ideal types in his analysis of the differences between foraging, farming, and fossil fuel societies. He knows, for example, that there's no actual historical society that corresponds to his model of a foraging society. But that's not the point of the model. The point of the model is to abstract from the value systems we observe in actual foraging societies and use them to construct a hypothetical, idealized model of a foraging society's value system. The second key idea I take from Morris's theory is how the technological base of society influences its values. But what I want to suggest is that one of the main determinants of our foundational values is not the technology of energy capture per se, but rather the form of intelligence that is prioritized and mobilized in society. Now, here I define intelligence as the capacity to solve problems across different environments. And intelligence is, I submit, a basic resource of human beings and human civilizations. It's what we rely upon for our survival, and indeed it is what makes other forms of technological change, including changes in the technology of energy capture, possible. And I would also suggest that there are three basic forms that intelligence can take in human society: individual intelligence, collective intelligence, and artificial intelligence. So here then is my big idea. For each kind of intelligence, there is a corresponding ideal type of value system, i.e. a system of values that protects, encourages, and reinforces that particular mode of intelligence. The value systems that we see in the real world are the product of trade-offs between the ideal value systems associated with these different modes of intelligence. Much of human history has involved a contest between the individual and the collective mode of intelligence. More recently, the values associated with artificial forms of intelligence have been added to the mix. And so what was once a tug of war between the individual and the collective has now become a three-way contest between the individual, the collective, and the artificial. And my main thesis here is that the constitutions of the future will be defined by how they resolve the struggle between these types of intelligence and their associated value systems. So look, that's the model in a nutshell. Let me try to clarify it now by translating it into a picture. Now in the image on screen, I've drawn a triangle, and each vertex of the triangle is going to be occupied by one of the ideal types of society. the society that prioritizes individual intelligence, the society that prioritizes collective intelligence, and the society that prioritizes artificial intelligence. The claim I'm making then is that societies can be classified, real societies, according to their location within this triangle, and their position will depend on how they manage the trade-off between the three different types of intelligence. Now look, the value of this picture depends on what we understand by its contents. So in what remains, I just want to provide a brief sketch of each ideal type of society and its associated value system. Let's start with individual intelligence. Individual intelligence is the intelligence associated with individual human beings, that, in other words, it's their capacity to use mental models and tools to solve problems and achieve goals in the world around them. In its idealized form, individual intelligence is distinct from the collective and artificial forms of intelligence. In other words, the idealized form of individual intelligence is entirely self-reliant and self-determining. It is promoted by any and all technologies that promote problem-solving capacity and self-reliance. This includes most traditional technological tools, but can also include novel technologies of individual enhancement. So I'm thinking here about things like cognitive enhancement, cyborgification, genetic engineering, those kinds of things. The associated value systems will consequently place an emphasis on intelligent individuals as the most important moral subjects. It will ensure that the individual is protected from interference, that he or she can benefit from the fruits of their labor, and that their capacities are developed to their full potential. In other words, it will be a very liberal value system, albeit a liberal value system on steroids. Contrast that then with the collective intelligence society. Collective intelligence is the intelligence associated with groups of human beings, and it arises from their ability to coordinate and cooperate in order to solve problems. Examples here might include groups of hunters coordinating on attack on a deer or a bison, or indeed a group of scientists working in a lab trying to develop a vaccine. Now, collective intelligence thrives on technologies that make collective communication and coordination possible. The idealized form of collective intelligence sees the individual as just a cog in a collective mind. And the associated value system is consequently one that emphasizes the group as the most important moral subject and values things like group cohesion, collective welfare, common ownership, and equality of power and wealth. In essence, it will be a strongly communistic, socialistic, possibly even nationalistic value system. And then finally, we have the artificially intelligent society. Now, artificial intelligence is the kind of intelligence associated with computer-programmed machines. It mixes and copies elements from individual and collective intelligence, since humans created it and oftentimes their data fuels it. But it is also based on some of its own tricks and capacities. It functions in forms and at speeds that are distinct from human intelligence. And while it is initially used as a tool or a set of tools for human benefit, it can function autonomously from humans and without their input. The idealized form of artificial intelligence is really one that is entirely independent from human intelligence. And the associated ideal type of value system is consequently one in which human intelligence is devalued and in which machines do all the important cognitive work, in which we are treated as, at best, really the moral patients or beneficiaries of their successes. Think here about the future of automated leisure that we see in the movie like WALL-E or perhaps E.N.M. Banks's culture novels. So instead of focusing on individual self-reliance and group cohesion, the artificially intelligent value system will be one that prioritizes human pleasure, recreation, game playing, idleness, and machine-mediated abundance. This is the kind of value system implied by the technology. Now, look, the sketch of this last type of ideal value system is a little bit anthropocentric. It assumes that humans will still be the primary moral subjects and beneficiaries of the artificially intelligent social order. And I think you can challenge this and argue that a truly artificially intelligent order would be one in which machines themselves are treated as the primary moral subjects. That's a possibility that should certainly be entertained. But let me now just conclude by emphasizing the key points of the model that I've just developed. My claim is that human society once thrived on a combination of individual and collective intelligence. Using this combination of intelligences, we built a modern and industrially complex society with a mix of liberal and communitarian constitutional values. Eventually, the combination of these intelligences allowed us to create a technology that has the potential to render our intelligence obsolete and can manage the social order now on our behalf. So how we manage the drift towards the artificially intelligent society will determine the values that we enshrine and protect in the constitutions of the future. We are not destined to end up at one particular vertex of the triangle that I've illustrated on the screen. There are a range of possible constitutional orders between here and there. And I close really then by just issuing a call to arms. Let's try to imagine the possible futures together collectively and see where our different forms of intelligence might take us. I'd like to thank you for your attention.